Welcome, historians. Today we're going to be talking about geography. Every ancient civilization we discussed this year, and really all civilizations, ancient and modern, have at least one thing in common, and that's they all share the same planet with each other. We're all Earth civilizations, and so it perhaps pays to study Earth in a bit more detail. So we're going to start off by learning the terms and ideas that we really need to know in order to make a more academic and official study of this Earth that we all share. So geography is the study of the Earth, but that means an awful lot. So we usually break it down into two main categories: physical geography and human geography. Physical geography has to deal with the stuff the Earth is made up of. It has to do with landforms, it has to do with bodies of water, it has to do with climate and weather. When we talk about physical geography, we're talking largely about things that we can see and experience and will one day have an impact on the human civilizations that we are talking about. By landforms, we really mean just all the different arrangements of land that we find in the world. Everything from a continent to an island is a type of landform, and there's really countless varieties, from peninsulas to mesas to mountains and valleys. All of these different landforms have different impacts on the civilizations that develop there. Physical geography also includes concepts like climate and weather. Climate and weather are often talked about in the same sentences, but to draw a distinction, the weather is the atmospheric conditions at any given moment in any given place. Is it raining right now? Is it sunny right now? What is the temperature right now? Climate is the pattern of weather over a certain amount of time. So what is the weather likely to be on average? What types of weather would we expect in a particular region, right? So we don't know what the weather is going to be in New Jersey on any particular day, but we have a good idea of what the climate in New Jersey is like generally, which gives us some ability to, prepare for the weather, even if we don't know exactly what it is. The environment is the climate plus all of those landforms that we've been talking about. Now, despite the Earth being very old and very enduring, it is not immune to change, and physical processes often affect geography, often affect landforms themselves. And we can see the interplay between landforms and climate in a lot of different ways. So probably the most obvious example is something like erosion. Erosion is the process by which the weather can slowly chip away, slowly erode, slowly sand down landforms. The most obvious example is a river carving its way through the landscape and eventually creating a river valley. You can have incredible landforms like the Grand Canyon created by the flowing water of a relatively minor river like the Colorado. It's not the biggest or most powerful river, but give it a few million years and it can do something pretty wonderful. Erosion is also seen just by rain, by oceans and lakes. Think of the pebbles that you find on a beach, which have been washed completely smooth by the waves over time. That's the process of erosion. Humans can have a hand in physical processes that affect the landscape as well. Pollution, for example, can slowly, over time, accumulate and actually impact the climate. Human geography is a little bit more subtle. Human geography is the study of how people interact with their environment and how the environment impacts human civilization and the development of human societies. So first we have to think about how humans make sense of geography. How do humans make sense of the physical space that they find themselves in? So first, we'll talk about location. People use location to help plan their civilization, to help communicate. They need to describe locations in order to be a society, in order to be able to say things like, let's build the new grain storage facility on the north end of town. Or, I noticed that there was a lake with a lot of fresh fish a few miles south of here. We need to be able to reference locations somewhat precisely. And we've come up with tools to help with this. Modern geographers, or modern everybody really, is familiar with globes and maps. Globes are a spherical representation of the surface of the Earth. This is awfully convenient because the Earth is more or less a sphere, so a globe can be a pretty exact recreation, just a scaled down actual globe. This means that we can show everything on the globe much the way it would appear if you were taking a picture from space. Everything can be represented accurately. However, a globe isn't exactly convenient to carry around. It's hard to draw on if you need to plot a course, and generally is just all around difficult. So people like to use maps. Maps are 2D representations of the surface of the Earth. Think of trying to unwrap a globe and lay it flat. Maybe you've tried this with an orange peel, trying to get the peel and rind off of an orange without tearing it at all. If you do it successfully, the resulting 2D strip of peel can actually be refolded into the sphere, just with no orange inside. No matter what kind of map you make, though, it's not going to be perfect. You just can't lay a globe flat without distorting something. The most common type of map, and the one you'll likely see in your classroom, is called a Mercator projection map. So it tries to project the surface of the globe onto a 2D area. Most maps are trying to do this in one way or another. The Mercator map became the most popular because it was absolutely essential for early sailors and explorers to chart their way across vast oceans. You needed a map that would be accurate over long distances and would display latitude and longitude lines at 90-degree angles so that you could easily chart your course and know your bearings. Because this map was so popular, it's more or less become standard, but it has its problems. For example, the further away from the equator you move, north or south, on a Mercator map, the more distorted the size of landforms become. Land that's at the extreme north or south of the map is inflated in size to a truly massive degree. If you look at a Mercator projection map, it looks like Greenland is so big that only 2 or maybe 3 Greenlands could fit into an entire continent like Africa. If you take the Mercator map for granted, then that certainly seems to be the case. However, if you look on a globe, or satellite images for that matter, you can see that over 14 Greenlands would fit into Africa. But Greenland is so far north, and so much of Africa lies near the equator, that their relative sizes are distorted. So any country or continent that is to the extreme north or south will be severely overrepresented on a Mercator map. Canada's not as big as you thought. Neither is Russia. Alaska's not as huge as you would think compared to the other states. And Australia is a bit bigger than it should be as well. But every map has its own problems. Maps that keep the sizes consistent can't always keep the shapes consistent, or the distances. So every type of projection is a trade-off. What do you want to be accurate, and what matters less? You can make a map that is proportional both in size and shape if you're okay with it not being a rectangle. Speaking of latitude and longitude, we should define these quickly. Latitude and longitude are imaginary lines that we've drawn to subdivide the surface of the Earth. Lines of latitude go around the globe from east to west, or west to east, doesn't really matter. The equator is 0 degrees at latitude, and we judge things to be north or south based on this. Lines of longitude go north and south, and we judge them based on the prime meridian, which is like the equator of longitude. Using these two measurements, you can give the absolute location of anything in the world if you want to be precise enough. When you say something is 30 degrees north and 20 degrees east, or whatever the case is, you're giving something's absolute location in latitude and longitude. However, people very rarely actually do this, because it's hard to know the exact latitude and longitude of everything unless you've got your maps, globes, and GPS systems all set up. For casual directions, we usually talk about relative location, where something is compared to something else. If you need to know how to get to the coffee shop, I'm not going to tell you its latitude and longitude. I'll just tell you it's next to the grocery store, or it's across the street from the tea shop. That might be a lot more helpful to you, at least if you know those other locations. So, for example, I could give you the exact latitude and longitude of the Statue of Liberty, but if you weren't already familiar with the coordinates, that actually might not tell you a lot about where it is. However, if I said it's in New York Bay, or if I said it's just off the coast of Manhattan, then you would have a pretty good idea. Relative locations might be pretty specific, like in New York Bay off the southern coast of Manhattan, but relative locations also might be more abstract. The Statue of Liberty's relative location is also east of the Mississippi River, or west of Europe, or underneath space. Those might be of limited help if you are actually trying to find the statue. Next, let's talk about regions. Regions are an idea that comes from the belief that the surface of the Earth really has got to be carved up in some way so that we can understand it a little bit better, right? There needs to be some distinction between here and there if we're going to get our brains around all the different places and people in the world. So regions are just areas, and they come in three varieties: formal, functional, and perceived. A formal region is the easiest to understand. It's any region that has formal or specific borders. Now, sometimes these are natural borders like a mountain range or a desert that's inhospitable to people, and so it really forms the edge of what a civilization might be. But in modern times, we're usually just talking about political borders. Where does the United States stop and Canada begin? This was just a decision that people made at some point, not necessarily based on any geographical features or other natural reasons why you would choose that particular line of latitude as compared to another one. Nevertheless, this makes both countries a formal region. They have specific defined borders. The next type of region is called a functional region. This is a region that certainly has some specific, probably named places in it, but the exact borders of the region are ill-defined. Nobody can say exactly where they start and exactly where they stop. A functional region is the area around a particularly important geographical location, where life in that region tends to revolve around that point. So, for example, New York City and its surrounding suburbs is a functional region. New York City itself is a formal region. It has borders. But what exactly counts as a suburb of New York City? What exactly counts as the area around New York City that both supports New York City and depends on New York City? Many towns in northern Jersey would not exist if it weren't for people commuting into and out of New York City each day. Many towns in the lower Hudson Valley would never have been founded without the industry needed to bring resources and materials down the river to the city. Many people commute in and out of the city each day, and some never do, but their impact is still felt across the functional region. So New York City and its surrounding suburbs, or perhaps you would say the New York City metropolitan area, the metropolitan area of Los Angeles or of Tokyo. Any large major metropolitan city will have an area around it that more or less depends on it and on which it depends. So life in these areas really circles around this one particular important location, whether or not you happen to live in the formal borders of it. The next type of region is really the most fun to talk about, and in some ways the most important in terms of really studying anthropologically and geographically human civilization. And that's the perceived region. A perceived region is an area that does not depend on any sort of specific borders, and in fact, people would probably disagree very vehemently over exactly where the lines of these perceived regions might be, but nevertheless have cultural identifiers that people ascribe to it. Sometimes people in these regions agree with these cultural classifications, and sometimes they might not have any idea. But a perceived region is a region that exists more or less in people's minds. People in a particular area are a certain way, or a particular area is a certain way, and that's distinct from the different areas around it. Sometimes these are more important than others, and sometimes you could be in several perceived regions at the same time. So, for example, New York City is in the northeast of the United States, and the northeastern United States is a perceived region. Where exactly does the northeast end, and where exactly does it begin? People will get into arguments over that. Is New York a part of the northeast? Most people say so. But people in New Hampshire or Vermont might disagree. Is Maryland a part of the northeast? That's a little more controversial. Jersey usually gets there, but it's clearly on the edge, and most people would say by the time you've hit Pennsylvania, you've obviously left the Northeast. But you've never really passed a border that said you are now leaving the Northeast region. Nevertheless, people associate certain cultural things with the Northeast. Going to see the leaves change during the fall, the connection to early colonial America, and pilgrims and all of that good history. People might associate certain foods with the Northeast that you would never associate with the Southwest or the West Coast or any of these other perceived regions. At the same time, the Northeast includes the perceived region that we would call New England. Is that a subsection of the Northeast? Is it another perceived region? Where does that one start? New York usually doesn't get into this one, but it's definitely a lot closer to New England than New Jersey is, even though New York and New Jersey border each other. However, New England often defines itself in relation to not being New York, and how it's different than New York, even though they're both in the Northeast. So perceived regions can be a funny thing. We might have perceived notions about Midwesterners, and they might have perceived notions about us. We both might agree that the other is indeed a region and that it definitely exists, but we might disagree over what exactly constitutes that region, or exactly where it is and where it starts and stops. There's all sorts of perceived regions. So French-speaking Canada would be an example of a perceived region. There's no one particular area where the commonness of speaking French goes up when you cross a certain border, nor does it center around one city or location in particular, but in certain areas you have higher prevalences of French-speaking Canadians than others. Finally, let's talk about the geographical impacts that the combination of landforms and climate can have on human development. So one obvious impact of the geography on human development is how geography impacts resources that early civilizations have access to. After all, it's the geography, the landforms, that determine what sorts of natural resources are around. Are there lots of useful metals buried just under the surface? Is there a lot of groundwater that makes it easy to dig wells? Is there a river that floods regularly and can therefore be very useful in seasonal farming? Is there a river that floods unpredictably and therefore should be stayed away from? Resources and the constraints provided by geography influence the development of human civilization in all of these obvious ways. If you were to found a city, you obviously would want to pay a lot of attention to the geography of the area in determining the best location to start settling or start building. Geography also affects the culture that develops in these human civilizations, as a lot of culture is response to environmental factors. Do you develop a farming culture because the soil happens to be particularly nutrient dense, or do you develop more of a hunting or nomadic culture because agriculture is not sustainable in your region? Do you develop warm clothing as a response to cold environments, or do you develop ways to deal with excessive heat as a response to warm environments? Over time, these adaptations to the environment can become a very important part of an area's culture. Just think of all the different cultural activities that New Englanders participate in relative to winter, from snowball fights to sledding down hills. These are all cultural activities that started in response to the local geography and climate. There's very little skiing culture around the equator, and there's very little long-distance running culture in the Arctic regions. So as we can see, geography being the study of the Earth means that there's an awful lot. In terms of history, physical and human geography are important because you can't study civilization, especially early civilizations, without understanding how geography and humanity impact each other. Climate affects landforms affect civilization can affect landforms, civilization can affect climate. All of these different combinations create an incredibly complicated network of cause and effect, which we need to understand if we want to understand ourselves from the past.